I was recording the intro of this video, and I noticed for the first time ever, Rosaria has like crazy bags under her eyes. This is peak character design. You can't beat this. Hello. To balance out their acts of evil and maintain a negative karmic debt, every time that they do something good and actually a little bit nice for once, Hoyo has to go back on it and do something horrible and shitty. Because they finally give us the 4 stars that are going to be on the Phase 2 banners at the beginning of the patch, but then they put all the shitty 4 stars on the new banners and put all the good 4 stars on the rerun banners. One of those good 4 stars is Rosaria. Let's talk about her. Rosaria is a character that I have been playing for a long time. And I mean a long time. She's probably in my top 10 most used units, and I found her to be pretty valuable at a lot of different levels of investment. Anyways, what does she do? Normal attacks, they're pretty unnoteworthy. I like the animations, so I leveled them up. She has some stuff in her constellations that buffs her normal attack playstyle, but none of it is good enough to matter. Her skill is where the fun starts. Tappy to teleport behind enemies and slash them. It actually does a very good amount of damage. It hits twice and is good at proccing Fav, or Sack Spear if Sack Spear existed. If you can't reach an enemy's back, you'll teleport in front of them and do the slash instead. It has some clunkiness. Unless you end up using Rosaria for a very, very long time, it's something that you won't notice. It generates particles with the second hit. You can see there the Fav particles generated with the first hit and the cryo particles generated with the second. The cooldown starts at the first hit, so it is technically possible to teleport in, do the first hit, have it go on cooldown, but then be hit out of the second hit and not generate any particles. It's also auto-target, which can be kind of annoying. And then we have the main part of her kit, her burst. Pretty low energy cost, only 60. Summons this Ice Lance that sticks into the ground and then deals damage over time. Hits every other second, and it applies cryo on every hit. This burst also snapshots, meaning that whatever your stats were when you initially cast it, when you press the burst button, it will maintain those stats and it will deal damage using those stats for its whole duration. Her first Ascension passive is where the teleporting behind enemies part of her skill comes into play. If she hits enemies from behind, it increases her crit rate by 12% for 5 seconds. Now 5 seconds doesn't seem like a lot of time, and it's not, but her burst snapshotting lets her actually make use of that tiny buff uptime. And her second A4 passive, it's actually a really powerful buff. I forget about it a lot. I tend to use Rosaria mostly as a generic sub DPS. It's a crit rate buff, and I believe this also snapshots. Don't quote me on it. So whatever Rosaria's crit rate was when she first cast her burst, she'll give 15% of that for the entire 10 seconds. 64.8, so it does snapshot. She does fine damage on her own, even with a pretty highly invested build like this one, but it's the combination of her personal damage and this buff which puts her over the edge and makes her worth using. And I usually don't talk about gear, but I think it's noteworthy that you can stack the buffs that she gives out without sacrificing too much damage by running her on Noblesse. Moving on to because there are a few that are pretty important. C1 is for the on-field playstyle. 10% attack speed and 10% normal attack damage is not a real buff. This is an aesthetic constellation. C2 is probably her most important and her best. At a baseline, her bursts only last 8 seconds. Because you also have the crit rate buff, it's not the worst thing in the world to be using a C0 Rosaria, but this is a 50% duration buff to her burst. A 50% longer burst means 50% more hits and 50% more damage. C2 is massive, and if you want to use Rosaria to her fullest extent, I would go for it, but she's not unusable without it. In quick swap teams, her skill can end up contributing a lot of her personal damage, being a reasonable multiplier on a low cooldown, but usually the burst levels are going to be a lot more important. C4 makes her already low burst cost even lower. It basically gives her her own personal Fav weapon. And C6 is generally not important. You can use it for some physical support stuff, and I'll actually be using it later in the video, but most of the time it's useless. Now that we're done with her, we can get on to her team. Number 1 is a pretty classic melt team. I'm going to show off 2 separate variations of this team and show how they play differently. My preferred unit here is citlali. You might be seeing a lot of citlali out of me in the next few videos. Being a combination buffer, shielder, and burst DPS means that you can squeeze use out of her in a lot of different scenarios. This is one of them. She gets to hold scroll set, which benefits both of the main damage dealers in this team. She also does a little pyro shred for Xiangling, but Xiangling is not meant to be the main DPS. She's just meant to apply a lot of pyro. Because citlali does most of her damage with her burst, she slots into a quick swap team pretty well. Xiangling is applying a lot of pyro, and Rosaria and citlali are your quick swap DPSs that get melts off of that. Enough about citlali, let's look at the other variation of this team that I like. Technically you can use any animal unit in this team. I'm using Lynette because she's free, so it's more accessible. But the more important thing is that she has a different elemental absorption priority than other units. It would be very easy to show off with the plethora of mushrooms down below. Animal units have an absorption priority, where whenever they use a move that absorbs an element, if they hit multiple elements at the same time, they'll always prioritize one. On most units, that order is Hydro, Hydro, Electro, Cryo, otherwise known as FEC. So that means if there's Pyro and Hydro, then they'll always infuse Pyro. If there's Hydro and Electro, they'll do Hydro, so on and so on. Please stop applying elements to yourselves, guys. Pyro and Cryo. That ended in a Pyro infusion. Thank you, guys. There's all these Pyro and Hydro units, and then we get one Cryo. And Lynette has a different order. She prioritizes cryo over anything else. Because we have Bennett, who self-applies pyro, normally there would be no way to get anything except for a pyro absorption, and that is why we use Lynette in this team. While her cryo application isn't the most significant, and it doesn't always help Xiangling get melts, it does dampen the existing pyro aura, and more importantly, it doesn't apply more pyro like other animal units like Kazuha or Sucrose would, which makes it easier to get a cryo aura up and shred resistance with Swirl. She's free and she's fun, so anyone can enjoy this team. Something that I haven't mentioned, but you may have been able to see so far, Rosaria's burst is Circle Impact. You place it down once and it can't be moved. That's bad enough when it's characters like Bennett where you have to stand inside the field to get the buff, but it's way harder to force your enemies to stay within a certain area than it is to stand in an area yourself. Although our next team here is one that circumvents that issue. Freeze. This team brings me back to the good old 2.0 days. You've all heard it a million times before. Freeze used to be hard meta. With the Blizzard Strayer set, it was a very easy way to get a lot of damage. So that lasted a while until Hoyos decided to stop putting freezable enemies in Abyss. But they've actually recently just started doing freezable abysses again, and freeze still destroys all the content that you can use it against. So I think it's still worth talking about. When it comes to freeze, especially with Ayaka freeze, because she's very energy hungry, you're gonna want a second cryo unit. That cryo unit is basically always going to be either Rosaria or Shenhe. Your best in slot option is basically always Shenhe, but if you're familiar with the game, you'll actually realize that Shenhe doesn't exist, and Rosaria is a pretty good substitute. But as I mentioned before, a pretty big issue with Rosaria's damage is that it itself is Circle Impact. It's really easy for enemies to walk out of Rosaria's burst. Like, Rosaria, baby, I love you, but the amount of times I have seen enemies gently meander out of her burst field. In freeze teams, everything is in a perpetual state of being crowd controlled. Ayaka kinda has a similar issue to Rosaria. She has a fairly large AoE on her burst, but once it's out, it's really hard to control, which is why you play her in freeze. Along with the grouping, Rosaria gets to benefit from nearly every buff going on this team. The Cryo Res Shred, Kazuha's damage bonus, tenacity on Kokomi. This is one of those situations where Noblesse would definitely be her best in slot set. A variation of freeze, which I am sadly not going to be able to show off. Rosaria also works reasonably well in things like Mono Cryo. She benefits from all the Res Shred going on, all the damage buffing. It's really nothing special, but as a cryo unit who deals a reasonable amount of damage, she slots pretty well into teams like these. This next team structurally looks pretty similar to the first one that I showed off. The only thing we've done is swapped out Xiangling for Lynnie, and this isn't even necessarily a Lynnie team. He's just a stand-in for any pyro carry that applies a decent amount of their element. However, the addition of the dedicated carry unit makes it play a lot differently. Neither Rosaria nor citlali do enough cryo application on their own to support a pyro carry who has reasonable application, but because they both have reasonable benefits outside of their application in their damage and supportive utilities, what you can do is run them at the same time. Use 2 units who are okay at applying cryo, but also do other things to make up for the 1 unit that needs a lot of cryo application. You can see that the application doesn't line up perfectly, and I do have to wait a little bit before taking my shots. I believe the same goes for both Arlecchino and Mawika, but that extra less than half a second that I'm waiting is well worth doubling the damage of the shot. You can also try out a Yanfei version. Yeah, no, Yanfei, this still doesn't work. You should either go Vapor or Overload Yanfei. She just applies Pyro too fast, it's too much. But it works for other carries. We can talk about this team before we go on to the really cracked out one. Is it really a Mies video if I don't shove in a Burnmelt team where it doesn't belong? This works on all the same principles that the others have. Get both auras, use Pyro MC to get both damage buffs. Check to be sure. And this team kind of uses the fact that Emilie doesn't snapshot to use her as an on-fielder. With C6 Bennett, she applies enough pyro for Rosaria to get consistent melts off of. And even though her normals aren't doing a lot of damage, her skill is greatly benefiting from Bennett Burst. Emilie's really great because she doesn't deal any reaction damage. She doesn't need specific auras to be dealing her damage. So in this team, she's able to pop off and kind of main DPS while maintaining a strong pyro aura for Rosaria to react off. I recognize that a lot of people don't have Emilie because they think that she's a niche unit. You could go for someone like Nahida. I might not go Burnmelt if you don't have Emilie. She's kind of the thing that makes Burnmelt as busted as it is. Realistically, you could do something else like swapping Emilie out entirely for a pyro on-fielder. Going Nahida and actually making Bennett your on-fielder can also work fairly well. I like Burnmelt for the same reasons that I always do. It gives pretty easy access to the scroll set, and Emilie always does a lot to smooth out your team's DPS. Was that? No. Oh, wait, I skipped over one. Final team here. I'm saving this for last because I think the least people will care about it. I won't talk about it too long because I made a whole video about it already. Long story short, last patch, 5.2, a fair few reactions got their damage buffed, including Shatter, which it deals physical damage when you hit a frozen enemy with a blunt attack, which is something like a claymore. And this is a team built to maximize hyperbloom damage and shatter damage. 2 potential names for this one, either Shatterbloom or Hypershat. Brings me back to Rosaria's C6. This is the team that I use it in. Because shatter damage is considered physical damage, it gets affected by this. So Rosaria, she gets our freezes, she gets a little bit of res shred with both her C6 and superconducts. It is very clunky and awkward. There are a lot of little things that you kind of need to know to play it well. This is more of a Dori team, and it would be possible with another cryo unit, but I think Rosaria is the best because of that res shred. I also want to take a moment to talk about cryo and its interactions to other elements, and specifically its non-interactions. In a way, cryo is an inert element. It doesn't react with the other elements in the same ways. It just straight up does nothing with Dendro. Same with like Bloom Cores. Cryo does nothing to Bloom Cores. We had, say, Xiangling, she's going to change the entire setup of the team. She's going to steal Hyperbloom Cores from Dori and start doing versions. She might apply too much pyro for Farina and start burning. And maybe that team is still good, but Xiangling has essentially changed what that team is. Rosaria, as a cryo unit, gets to kind of freely throw on all her benefits and have next to no downsides. Basically, the only reaction that she can trigger in this team is freeze. But yeah, fun Dori team that also has Rosaria in it. That's it from me. Rosaria is a solid character who I have found a lot of fun and use in over all the years I played her. Damage is not all she does. She has a little bit of buffing, she has application, and she is a very solid cryo battery who will probably always find a place in quick swap teams. Next up is the Lanyan video. If you have any teams you want me to use in that one, or you have any questions that you have about Lanyan, throw them in the comments, I'll do my best. If you like this video, you can leave a like. If you like me, you can subscribe, and I hope y'all have a lovely day.